Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Mental Health and Business. This is Dr. Nicholas Samstag. I have the privilege today of talking to a very interesting creative person named Joshua Caldwell, who's done a number of really interesting movies. He's a director and producer and writer, and we're going to talk about all kinds of things, ranging from creativity and what it's like to be in Hollywood to God knows what else. Welcome, Josh. Thank you so
Thank you.
much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. We'll talk about the mental health in the movie business.
We'll be here a long time and not exhaust that.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure. That's a whole series of podcasts.
series of right. So one of the things makes me think before we even begin. It makes me think of. I thought of Hamlet and the play within the play. That when you're doing theater and you're directing, you're obviously immersing yourself in everybody's psychology. Yours too. So one of the questions I asked you before I hit the start button was when you direct, are you coming from a particular school? Are you coming from a Hitchcockian school or a method acting school, or how do you? What's your thing?
I'm coming from a Caldwellian school.
There we go. Best answer.
No, I mean I'm largely a self-taught director. So I started making movies in high school. Learning both from kind of DVDs, when this was like late 90s, when all of a sudden DVDs were like first coming out, and every movie in existence had a 4 disc behind the scenes set, that you could go and watch.
Uh,
And this was pre-internet, really. I mean, you had AOL and that was about it. And so a lot of it was just trying to watch these behind the scenes and understand how are they doing things? What is that equipment? What is that, uh, just trying to get a sense of what it was like to make a movie, because otherwise you were looking at magazines or something like that, and that was all you had. But then I also had a video production class in high school that I got to be a part of, and that was like 2 periods a day, and we got to make documentaries and music videos and narrative films and things like that. All terrible, like narrative films with high school students and things like that. Um, but the really fun part was at my high school we got to make I was privileged to make these, like what we called them, ASB movies, which basically were for the student body, like officers, the president, vice president. Our school, Bellevue High School in Seattle, had a history of making parody films to announce whatever the
well,
next homecoming theme or the
uh,
next officers. And so they would take popular movies and they would make parodies of them, starring the kids from the school. And then they would
one,
show them in front of the entire school, which was like the coolest part, So I got to get involved with that through a friend, and then took over doing that when I was there my senior year. And we made, we did a like a Usual Suspects parody. We did a Star Wars parody. We did a what do you call it? A soap opera parody. So that's kind of how I learned to make movies, by sort of mimicking others and looking at what they were doing and then trying to do it myself.
mhm.
And then I went to Fordham University, which did not have a traditional film program. So I studied communications and English and things like that. But I just kept working at it on my own. I kept making movies on my own and sort of
Mhm.
figuring out what worked, what did I like, what did I not like, what worked for me, what didn't. So really self-taught, and over the past 10, well, now 12 years directing full time, plus the time I put in before that, just sort of built up my own approach to filmmaking, um, that I guess works.
Yes, works. So is there a link to, you mentioned English? Is there a link to literature here? Is there? Do you have?
um, I mean, sort of. I mean, I'm a big reader. I love reading books, and in some cases more than I like watching movies. Um, I think, I was always like that. Even when I was younger, I'd come home and nothing made me happier than sitting on the couch and reading a book. Um, and so I definitely kept that up. I think that what's interesting is that, with literature, you get sort of a literal window into, a character's psychology. Like a lot of it gets explained to you, because you can read the innermost thoughts of the characters that you're following. Movies don't have that option unless they pontificate and tell you what they're thinking. And so one of the things that's always interested me, specifically in terms of psychology, in a lot of ways, what is behavior? And that is what storytelling is conveying behavior that, is either in line with a character or out of line with the character. And then why is it out of line with the character? And so since I was young and impressionable and trying to make movies, I was always very interested in the psychology of character. But then beyond that, how to utilize the camera to inform the psychology of the film to an audience.
Mhm.
I've never really been interested in the objective approach to filmmaking. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's never really interested me as a director. I've always much more interested in a subjective approach to filmmaking, feeling you mentioned Hitchcock, but feeling the creator or the director or the filmmaker's sort of thumbprint on what you're watching.
Mm.
And I've always loved the films of specifically of Michael Mann because I think he does such a wonderful job of infusing every sort of frame and every shot with a deep, several layer deep, level of psychology and everything else he's done, all the work he's done
Mhm.
to put into that. And I always got interested in that. Um, I always felt like what I often felt was sometimes with literature, right? Because you'd be in these English classes and they'd be like, well, what does the author mean? And I'm like, part of me was convinced sometimes the author was just writing and stuff was coming out. He wasn't
Uh-huh.
as, that they weren't as intentional as we're making them out to be. I think that was a little naive because obviously with the use of editors and going back through the books, everybody, you're definitely cluing into things. But I always compared it to like movies where like if you're gonna have a bunch of mirrors in the scene, that has to be like kind of an intentional choice, unless it's like just a mirror in the bathroom, right? But if I remember there's a movie called Hearts of Darkness. No, not to Hearts of Darkness, Hearts of what was it? It was based on a Stephen King novel. But I remember there was a shot in there that contained all these mirrors, and I go, well, that somebody had to think up that idea. They had to very specifically say, I need a wall of mirrors, and what is the meaning of that, right, and that kind of thing. And so, um, at the same time, one of the running gags when we were making Mending the Line between me and my AD was that I don't remember how it started, but there would be constant times when I'd come up to our AD Charity and I'd be like, I think the yellow in this scene is symbolizing and she would of course start laughing. And I always wanted to find a way to try and get her with that because at some point it is kind of absurd, right? When you start talking about, it's making movies is not deadly serious, and at the same time though, I don't totally discount that the color yellow has an impact on an audience in some way.
Of course, and you're opening up like one of the most interesting and at times contentious um, conversations around, right? Which is what is the what is a how to think about literature, how to think about art, like how to evaluate art or appreciate art thoughtfully without creating a whole system that seems irrelevant to it, right?
Yeah.
So that
And
I
it
was
can be, and like novels and art, paintings, things like that. Movies can be interpretive by the audience. They
well,
they
well, right
you know
from
they
people
don't
like
have to be literal, sort of surface level things, which a lot of them are. You
for,
know,
right. I mean, the human brain necessarily symbolizes and necessarily interprets multiple things at multiple times, all times.
right?
So the whole notion of this movie means this or this poem means that always struck me as patently absurd.
Yeah,
Although it's interesting to think about. It's interesting to think about what the author or director intended.
yeah,
But a number of very smart people, throughout history, have said, once it leaves the page, it's out of my hands,
yeah.
or once it's right. So that leads us into what must be a kind of circus, a wonderful circus, in trying to corral these actors. Like, how do you do that? How do you deal with actors?
Well, I think that like for me, um, it's a very collaborative environment. I think that I I try not to be just moving furniture, right? Which is a term that gets often used with directors where you're like, okay, you're gonna go this, you're gonna do this, right? I do try to really give them freedom to bring their own interpretations to it, to change lines to fit with what they think the character is going to be. Because I think, like, you know, I can see things and I have to guide things on a macro level, but their job is to exist in the micro level, right? And it's sort of that combination because, like, I and the way I've always talked about working with actors is that we, between them and I, the goal in sort of pre-production, sort of early prep when we're talking about the characters and things like that, the goal is to come to an understanding of a character profile, who this character most generally is, right? And it's funny because you talk about corralling the actors, and I literally say what we're doing is we're building a corral,
Mm.
and the fence of the corral are sort of facts, um, things that are sort of either within the script or, are they, did their parents get divorced? Are they an only child? Do they have brothers and sisters? Are they male? Are they female? Are they neither? Like, really understanding who, like, just factually, like, we want to make sure we have sort of a understanding of who this character is, so that if you come in and you're a female character, you steadily start acting like a man, that's not going to work. That's not going to be right. You
Right.
know, it's getting an understanding of who the character is, sort of on this sort of the creating the boundary of the character, but then within that corral, they have freedom to kind of go where their emotions and the scenes and the dialogue sort of take them. I don't want to put them on train tracks where they're like,
Right.
every line's the same thing and you got to do this and you got to do that. Like, I want to allow, because the whole idea is if we can collaboratively create a character and they can then exist as that character, then I truly believe that, like, there is no real wrong way for them to play the scene.
Right.
There may be scenes of ways that work better than others, and yes, there are clearly wrong ways. But if at some point during something they start getting emotional or they react in sort of an emotional way, the whole goal is that that's happening because they're living in the moment and they're
That's right.
existing as that character. So that's where I try to get to. So it is talking, having very deep dive conversations into the psychology of the character, their background. I do a lot of prep work beforehand. I create sort of a massive document going through the script of developing out what I think, right? And then we have a lot of conversations centered around the script and the choices that are being made and why the character is doing this, why are they doing that, you know. And some of the stuff that I figured out is informed, and other stuff gets thrown away because the actor comes with a better idea. I think that, like, at some point I give it over to them, like, you guys have to take this and really make it your own. But to do that, it's always key to have a very good understanding. And by the way, for example, like, in some of my movies, like with Bella, when I did a movie, Bella Thorne, when I did Infamous, we had spent like a year together prior to making that movie, kind of just not every day, but like continually talking about the character. We'd meet up or we'd hop on a Zoom or like whatever, and we'd talk
Mm.
about ideas around this person and this character and who she was and what she was doing. And she'd bring things to the table that I would then change in the script and things like that.
Mm.
And then meanwhile, and we'd really deep dive into it. Meanwhile, like, on Mending the Line with Brian, I think I had one conversation with him prior to making the movie. And I was like, do you want to meet anybody? Can I introduce you to, he's like, no, I know some people. I got it. Don't worry about it. I think the one thing we did prep with him was trying to get him to teach him how to cast a fly rod.
Yeah.
Um, but other than that, there wasn't really much conversation to be had. I know, like, Sinqua and I would talk a lot about the character, and Perry and I would talk a lot, but like with Brian, like with Wes, I mean, these guys are pros. Like, what
Mm.
am I going to say, like to Brian Cox to tell him, this? And but I also trust the actors. Like, I think, like, so much of directing is just casting well and
Mm.
then not getting in their way, and just sort of helping to guide them when you need to guide them. But, it's not as complicated as people make it out to be. Like, very rarely are you saying, like, okay, like, here's your motivation, which is such a, a sort of uh, cliche thing to do, and also, there's a lot of books on like action words and verbs and you're this and you're that. And I find that often it's really talking more about sort of personal experience. It's like
Right.
when,
Right.
and also just talking a lot more about sort of the psychology of the character and then letting them kind of do what they need to do within the scene to navigate from beginning to end.
Well, that sounds very textured and smart. There's an old Hitchcock joke about when one of his actors says, "What's my motivation?" and he says, "Your paycheck."
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, but it sounds like what you're describing is courting the surprise. It's like you do your homework and you do as thorough a job as you can, and then you let everybody loose and hope that they surprise themselves.
Yeah.
That's a whole thing about literature,
You're
right?
you're
If
you're
you're not
manufacturing a surprise, basically.
right, if you as the writer or the director aren't surprised, your audience likely won't be either.
Yeah.
Um, that's
But I think that what that does is it gets you to a place where you're not necessarily acting, you're existing. And I think when you hear about, Michael Mann talking about Daniel Day-Lewis as Hawkeye in Last of the Mohicans, or De Niro in Heat, or Cruise in Collateral, like it's all that same stuff. Like you want them within the scene to not be acting. You
right.
want them to be existing. And the
Yeah,
more you can get to that, I think the better the performances end up being. I mean, not in every case. Some actors don't need it. They don't need a year of prep to get into character and crush it. But that's, I think, what's also really interesting about actors is like they all come from different backgrounds.
right,
They all come from a different approach to material, and a lot of them come from different acting skills, and things they picked up along the way as they work with other directors. And so part of my job also is to have an understanding of that with them. Like, how do you like to work? What are you looking for? What do you want me to do? You want me to, like, they hear about, I think like Morgan Freeman once said, he really just wants the director to tell him action cut. Like he's not looking for like long discussions in between takes,
right.
whereas others really want to like deep dive into those conversations either prior to making the movie or even in between takes, like as they try
Uh-huh.
something different.
It sounds like you favor the collaborative process, right? Like you like to be in there with them.
It just depends. I think that it's not really preferring one over the other. It's sort of just making sure that they have whatever they need in order to perform their best. If
Sure.
they don't need a lot, then they don't need a lot. I just enjoy the discussion, right? Because I think like one of the things that I again, you talk about the surprise, right? A lot of times, how many times have I had a discussion with an actor where suddenly we land on this, I'm A, they're B, and we land on C that neither of us would have on our own thought about.
Mhm.
And that's always exciting to me because I think like that's a part of the benefit of doing the work is spending time sitting around with people and chatting about these imaginary characters
Right.
and everything there is to know about them, um, and then not, and then having that sort of turn up on set as a fully fledged sort of three-dimensional person,
Yeah.
character that they're playing.
Yeah. How exciting. That's so exciting.
Yeah.
What's Hollywood like?
Right now, not in a good place. I'll say that. I've Hollywood for me has been a very interesting trajectory because I feel like, and maybe this is me not quite knowing how it was, like prior to my sort of entering of it, but it seemed like for a while there was a lot of stability there. They sort of had theatrical for forever, and then kind of in the 90s you had DVDs came into play and home video was big, and so there was this like really decent return on movies, and a lot of really really great movies got made. I mean, as I mentioned, I'm a product of like the late 90s types of filmmakers, so Steven Soderbergh, Michael Mann, Clint Eastwood, um, David Fincher, Ridley Scott. These guys were all making the kinds of movies that I want to make, which are these studio driven, sort of well, not studio made, auteur driven films,
Right.
and unfortunately nobody's really making that anymore, unless you're very very high level and can kind of control your own destiny. Um, and so it's been very frustrating to sort of sense starting, because literally I graduated in 2006, and in 2007 we had the first, we had the writer's strike,
Right.
which was highly disruptive to the business. It was like prior to the writer's strike, you could probably get a spec script, very easily sold, and then kind of immediately after, it was like, well, who's attached? What actors attached? And you're
Mm-hmm.
going, well, if you're writing something for Will Ferrell, how are we getting Will Ferrell attached? You know what I mean? Is that your job, like at the studio, to try and get him attached? Like, I don't understand. So, and since then, it was just it's been very, very disruptive and very rocky. I worked in the digital space for a while for Anthony Zeiker, who created CSI. Um, and, the digital was sort of nascent and we were starting to do stuff. And then I ended up leaving that job and sort of setting out directing full time, thinking that, hey, I could probably make a name for myself doing some of this like advertising supported content.
Mm-hmm.
They were doing features that were playing digitally that were supported by advertising. And like literally a couple months after I left, that whole aspect of the business bottomed out and
Yeah.
collapsed. And then kind of always felt like I was a little just behind the sort of wave of, I was never TV. So like with the rise of TV in the late teens, I never really was on that wave. I was sort of still doing independence. And then of course we bump up against COVID, and then we bump up against the writers, the WGA and the SAG strike. And so it just feels like Hollywood has been unable to really like, especially in the last 5-6 years, has been unable to really kind of get a solid footing to sort of recover.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I know for a lot of people, it's really bad right now. It's really like challenging to get things and get things financed and get people attached. And so it's interesting. I mean, I don't know what's going to come of it. I don't know where it's going to go from here. I've always sort of worked in the indie space. I've never really worked in the studio space. I'd love to, but I haven't. But in the indie space, it's different, but it has its own challenges. And so I think like, especially in terms of like what you're thinking about, like mental health and business and stuff like that, that's probably one of the most challenging aspects of working in Hollywood, is just everything that comes at you that can really hit you mentally. And you have to have these kind of like safeguards in place, and you have to have these sort of like approaches that will allow you to deal with rejection, to deal with um, the high stakes pressure of making things, of spending millions of dollars of somebody else's money, of dealing with all these different personalities. I mean, that stuff's like super important, to sort of helping to combat the challenges that this industry faces, of late.
Right. Right. No. Yeah. I mean, thank you for that. I think I've never been to Hollywood,
Oh,
but
you meant Hollywood, literally the place Hollywood. It's okay. It's a little dirty, but
I'm teasing. Um, yeah, Hollywood as a place to work always has struck me as being very sharp elbowed.
it's
And
very
you
cutthroat.
have to
And
be.
the reason is because there's just for every person that has a job, there's 50 people who are waiting in line to take that job.
Right.
And it's a very interesting industry. It's a largely subjective industry. They've tried to objectify it and figure out how to decide why this film gets made versus that film, but it's impossible to do it. It really is. I mean, there's just no. It's like William Goldman always said, like nobody knows anything, and that's true. Like they're all just best guesses, and the question is, can you weather the we got it wrong,
Right.
in order to get to the hey, we got it right. Um, and Yeah, and it's the other thing that's really interesting about it, that sort of unrelated to this, but I've always found fascinating, is it is probably one of the only industries in the world where the cost to buy the product is not reflective of the cost to make it. So if
Huh.
it costs you more money to make a car, you're going to charge more money for that car, right? And Aston Martin is not the same price as a Honda. But in Hollywood, a $300 $300 million blockbuster costs the same to purchase either on iTunes or a ticket to see the film or whatever as it does a $50,000 indie film,
Right.
assuming that indie film gets distribution of some kind. But I always thought that was really interesting because there's just really no other industry like it. I mean, maybe the music industry, again, this arts thing,
Right.
sort of, but I always thought that, so that's also kind of an issue is like you are spending a lot more money on these movies and yet your audience base and your sort of like per person profit remains the same regardless of what you spend on it,
Right. 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 And
you
it
know?
right. And then there's the tension between the commercial versus the artistic success.
Right.
Right? Like when you what pond do you want to play in?
Yeah, and they always learn the wrong lessons. They don't learn the lesson from Barbie and Oppenheimer and stuff like that. It's always an outlier, you know, and they go back to doing what they're doing, which isn't working either.
Right.
So it's tough to say because it's very cyclical, and at the same time, like nobody really stays with it the entire time. Like everybody has a flop, everybody has something that doesn't work. Like it's just the nature of doing something. And by the way, it's also really tough because you can have stuff that doesn't work when it first comes out. And then like years later, all of a sudden people are latching onto it. It becomes this like
Right.
cult success. Um, and then the sort of lastly, just talking about what's going on, one of the other problems in Hollywood is just the whole thing with the streamers is you've completely lost your revenue stream from DVD, and home video, and it's now super reliant. Then they move to streamers, but like streamers just doesn't give you the same. I mean, Netflix is the only one that sort of figured it out, but even then, they're very, very dependent on subscriber growth.
Right.
You got to keep getting more people instead of just selling the same people more stuff,
Right.
right? And at some point, there's a limit to that. No matter what you do, there's only so many people on Earth, um, and
Right.
you can't resell them stuff. Whereas like you could sell somebody 10 separate movies a year, at the theater. Um, and so as a result, though, with like streamers, well, as a result of losing sort of DVD revenue, it just has become that much harder to make money, And the thing is that I'm sort of like we've had this experience in the indie world is like I just don't think anybody is buying a movie on iTunes anymore. Maybe they rent it, maybe, but most likely they're just going to wait because they know it's going to come out on a streamer, and
Mm.
that's, I think, kind of what happened with Mending the Line. So Mending the Line was in theaters, which we never expected to really do that great because it's a limited theatrical release and you have limited P&A spent against it. So a lot of people didn't even know it was at theaters, even though we thought we were telling everybody.
Mhm.
Um, and then it came out sort of in the fall of 2023. It got put out on iTunes and any VOD, any place where you have to pay to like download or own or rent the movie. And again, it did okay. It didn't do great. Again, I don't know who's buying Mending the Line, but when it came out on Netflix, we were the number one film in America for a week,
Mm.
and something like six million streams or something like that, of the film, which is like crazy. I mean, again, if everybody had sent that to the theater, we'd have made a ton of money and it would have done very well. But like I joke, I'm like, well, everybody waited until it was free on Netflix to see it. And that's a very, very challenging business model.
For sure. For sure.
So everyone's trying to figure this out. They're trying to like figure it out. My instinct is that it's going to mean lower budgets, which is good for me because I'm sort of very good at working with low budgets. Um, I've adjusted my thinking to just try to be looking for any ways to take advantage of the downtime, right? Like you look at Rockefeller and, most of his money was made during the downtimes in America. And so I'm just trying to, kind of be aware and keep an eye on what's going on and sort of see if there's a way to sort of take advantage of this instead of just looking at it as like, it's a bad time.
Yeah, of course. What tell us some of the projects you're working on now.
Well, that's always a fun thing about Hollywood. You can't really talk much about it. People don't really want to talk about it till it's like a deal's done or until it actually comes out or they have a
Right.
trailer.
Right.
But what I did was I kind of, so posts or kind of right around the strike, I sort of made a shift in where my attention was going. Prior to that, I focused mostly on just doing features and indie features. And, and then, but with the strike going on, nothing was happening. And so I kind of made a pivot to focus on doing a lot more sort of commercial brand work local to me in the Hudson Valley, just to stay shooting and stay on my toes and keep busy with it, and have some outlet for it.
Right.
So I put a lot of time and attention to that sort of company, and that's a company called Semicolon Inc. And we've done some good work with like sort of people here in the Hudson Valley and sort of building out a much more like emotional approach to advertising, instead of just like purely sales mini. But I'm having fun with that. I get to go, shoot quite a bit and stay busy with that. And then I'm sort of just now getting a feature going that will hopefully shoot this summer,
Oh, that's great. Which you can't talk about.
which I can't talk about. Not allowed to talk about. It's
Right.
also like it's like you just don't want to because
Well, of
like you haven't
course, of
made it
course.
yet, and it's like
Yeah,
who
I get
knows?
it. I get
Yeah.
it. Now, among your different hats of writing, producing, directing, what is it that you find yourself most engaged by these days?
I consider myself a director first. I'm a director who will write, but I'm not a writer who directs. So, like, I don't love spending a lot of time writing unless I'm just very, very excited and engaged with the material. So, I've written two of my 5 features I wrote. Um, and then I do a lot of rewriting. Like I'll rewrite, heading into a film. So I rewrote a good chunk of Mending the Line, but didn't take credit for it. So I enjoy rewriting a lot. I'm rewriting this thing I'm working on now that's going to shoot in the summer. But I find for me the challenge of writing is often I don't love the blank page. Like I try to get through a draft as quickly as possible so that I have something to work off of. Because if it's just I don't get writer's block, but I just find myself I'm not in love with like trying to find that new thing, like, okay, what am I writing next? What am I writing next? And like instead I'd rather like be like, okay, I know what this is and I know how to improve it, or I know how to
Mhm.
change it, or I know how to do this. Um, and then producing, I sort of just end up doing by necessity. I'm not really somebody who produces anybody else's work. I kind of produce my own. And so that becomes just something I do as a result of directing.
Mhm.
But
Sounds great.
if I could just direct, I'd probably just direct, to be honest.
Sounds great. What do you do for fun?
Big thing that I do for fun is fly fishing.
Oh,
I'm a fly fisherman, which is part of why I made Mending the Line, although it came to me completely randomly. So it wasn't because I was a fly fisherman that I made it. It was I happened to be a fly fisherman who got handed the script.
huh.
Um, But I find that fly fishing, especially as it relates to Mending the Line, for those who've seen it, Mending the Line is the story of a Marine who's wounded in Afghanistan. And he's sent to a VA clinic in Montana where he learns to fly fish as a way of dealing with his trauma, which is very much a real thing that organizations like Project Healing Waters and Warriors in Quiet Waters are doing with veterans. And then there's a bunch of other types of groups that work with I think there's Casting for Recovery, which is for survivors of breast cancer, and a
Hmm.
lot of other different groups around the country that do this because fly fishing in a very real way is a modality towards healing. And I don't have any trauma. I don't have any sort of personal things that I really deal with. I just find like fly fishing is one, it's really fun to do, but it just takes me out of the sort of mental world that I exist in for most of the time. Even if I'm on set, that's fine, but I'm on set a fraction of my overall time.
Right.
And so most of the other time I'm developing, I am writing, or I'm coming up with ideas, or I'm working with writers and I'm reading scripts. And a lot of that time you're just spending in your head. And
Mhm.
so to be able to go out onto a river and step out onto a stream and sort of exist like fly fishing forces you to exist in the present. It's really, really difficult to be thinking about other things while you're fly fishing because unlike say traditional spin fishing where you might, grab a lounge chair on the side of the bank and just kind of toss rappel out there, and wind it back, or like, a worm on the bobber. Um, Fly fishing is an incredibly active sport. You are wading into the river. Um, you are, balancing yourself on slippery rocks against a current. You've got to cast that fly line, so you're paying attention to what that's doing. And then once your fly actually hits the water, you may be getting only 6 inches of a drift before it starts to pull and not look real, and then you got to pick it up and you got to do it again. So like, it's incredibly difficult to just be absent-minded as you're basically fishing. It
Uh-huh.
requires a lot of focus, and I think that's why it actually really works as a modality for those who are experiencing, say, PTSD, because the sort of, PTSD creates this kind of like cycle that's very hard to break out of.
Right.
You're sort of unable to think about other things because you just end up keeping coming back to it because your mind is not occupied doing anything else.
Right.
When you're in a river and you're forced to pay attention to what's around you, it actually short circuits that sort of PTSD circle,
Huh.
and allows you to not be thinking about, allows your mind to rest, to not think about that for a period of time. And then you come out of it going, wow, I haven't thought about anything else except what my fly is doing on the river. So it's
Yeah.
incredibly powerful. I mean, I think that, like, there's other examples of that, where people have used it. I think like probably surfing is an example of that. I know there's veteran surfing organizations. I know
Yeah.
working with horses and animals is probably similar to that. I don't, like, people say there's hiking that does that. I don't know. For me, to me, I'm like always thinking about something else while I'm hiking. But, I think that's what's so powerful about it. So for me, it's got its own unique challenge of trying to find fish and catch fish and meet them where they are. And it's incredibly fun. I love it. It's one of my
It,
favorite things I do.
no, it sounds beautiful. It sounds beautiful. Years ago, I read about an outfit that a theater company for veterans. Is that right? But
Mm-hmm.
they were teaching veterans Shakespeare,
Hmm.
specifically soliloquies, and in the, I mean, this will be of of immediate relation to you. In that language, in being able to speak that language, the amount of feelings that come up
Yeah.
are tremendously powerful and profound.
Yeah.
And the hardcore Marines actually find themselves weeping and healing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah,
It's anything that can kind of short circuit your brain from just spiraling, you know?
yeah, for sure.
Um, and then excuse me. And then, being here in the Northeast, we get out and ski. My kids have gotten into skiing, which is a lot of fun. And then, we go into baseball season with my son and stay busy with kids sports and all that kind of stuff. So yeah,
How old's your son?
I have an 11-year-old son and a 7-year-old daughter.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
That's a nice age. Yeah, I have a 21-year-old daughter who's traipsing her way through Europe right now.
Oh, nice. Good for her. Good for
Yeah,
her.
yeah. All right, Josh. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. If people want to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
The easiest way really is to go on my Instagram. That's kind of become the default uh, website, if you will. And I'm at Joshua Caldwell Director, all one word. And from there, it sort of spins off into everything else I have going on.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
All right, man. We should do this again. That was fun.
Yeah. Good. I appreciate it.
Okay.
All right.
All right. This is Mental Health and Business signing off. Thanks so much. See you next time.